Hey y'all, my name is Josh Bain, and if you are new, I am one of the pastors here. Even if you're not new, I am still one of the pastors here, for better or worse. But like Catherine mentioned, we are beginning a brand new series today entitled Live, Work, Play. And I want to go ahead and tell you that next week is going to be very unique because next week we are talking about work. Maybe you're a college student trying to figure out what's next, trying to figure out what you want to be when you grow up. Maybe you've been in a career for 20 years. And you're trying to figure out what you want to be when you grow up. That is a lot of people I know. We all, I think, have been there in a lot of ways. A lot of us have big work questions we never talk about in church, right? And many of us are frustrated with our current job situation. We sort of lost our passion. We're kind of wondering, if we're supposed to be doing something else, if it might be time for a change. And so next week, we're going to talk all about work in church. And if that sounds like something you could use, I want to invite you back. And if you know somebody that can benefit from that, I want to encourage you to invite them as well. But why are we talking about work at church, and what do we mean by a series entitled Live, Work, Play? Well, the truth is we spend about 2/3 of our life working in some form or fashion. I hate to break that to you, it's true. And I love what our resident theologian, John Mark Comer, says. We have always had to have one of his quotes. We got about 30 seconds in. This time, John Mark Comer says that if we cut that part of our life off from God, the work part of our life, all the sort of mundane stuff, then we essentially cut Jesus out of the majority of our life. And so what ends up happening is we end up, in a place like this, spending the majority of our time teaching people how to live in the minority of their life. And it doesn't really make sense, right? So this is a series all about how do we integrate faith? What might it look like, right? What are some ways that we could? How is it appropriate or inappropriate to integrate faith where we live, where we work, and where we play? Because here's the deal, and you guys know this, but Sundays only really matter to the degree to which they impact Mondays. That Sundays are not designed to be a distraction from Monday through Fridays. Sundays are not just designed to be our way of atoning for what we did on Saturdays. Hashtag Athens, I love you, right? Careful when you search that hashtag. It can mean a couple different things, right? But Sundays ideally allow us to step into Monday with purpose and confidence and direction. And so for the next 3 weeks, I get to be the guide, and I want to talk for 3 weeks about your Monday through Friday life. Like, I want to talk about your Monday through Saturday life. Now, speaking of Saturday, can we all agree that there is nothing in the world more disturbing than when you see something like this? And if you can't see what this is, if you're listening to this via podcast, this is a house-divided license plate, Georgia and Tennessee. Anybody ever, see one of these on a car or driving down the road? Maybe this is you. Maybe you met somebody, right? And he's got blue eyes, and now your life is a country song, and you're wearing Tennessee orange for him. Even though, okay, that sounds personal. Even though I'm pretty sure the Bible talks about not doing stuff like this. Not to be unequally yoked. In fact, any house-divided people here today want to just own it? Your house divided? None. Great. We weeded them all out. That's perfect. That's what we were hoping for. Look, I got this in the mail the other day. I ordered this for today, and my wife was like, is there anything you need to tell me? Like, is everything okay? Like, what's going on? Actually, our middle daughter went through this contrarian phase recently called being a middle daughter, and you know who you are. Anyway, so she decided for a couple years ago that she was going to be a Florida fan. She wanted to be different and be a Florida fan. All the middle child are like, that sounds like something I would do. To which our oldest daughter said, well, look, if you love Florida so much, you should just move there, but we're never going to visit you. So stay tuned for my parenting series in about 20 years, maybe. I don't know. All right, why are we talking about this? Why are we talking about house divided? I mean, A, because it's about time we start standing up for the real issues around here as a church, people. But B, because, and this is the real point, of the whole sermon, honestly, because somewhere along the way, spiritual life got separated from the rest of our life in a way that it was never supposed to be. It was never supposed to be that way. Somewhere along the way, our spiritual life got divided from the rest of our life. In fact, this is crazy, but did you know that in the Hebrew language, there is no word for spiritual? There is no word for spiritual in the Hebrew language. If you ask them, how's your spiritual life? They would have just stared at you. What is that? What does that mean? That would have been like if you asked them, about their Peloton or how they like kombucha. They would go, if that's what the future's like, I don't know if I want to go there. I don't know what you mean by my spiritual life. They would have told you back in the Old Testament, I just have one life and one God who's just kind of over all of it, right? But then along came a man named Plato. And you have all heard of Plato. Perhaps you have even shopped at his closet before. But before Plato, thank you, got into secondhand fashion, he dabbled a little bit in philosophy. Yeah, now you get it. Okay, in philosophy. And this is important. Okay, Plato, back with me. Plato was the first person to ever separate the spiritual world from the physical world as if they were two separate places. Like this was a few hundred years before Jesus came on the scene, but Plato was the first guy with this idea that, what if the spiritual world and the physical world were two separate places? He wrote about this in what's called his theory of forms, and if you're a philosophy major, I'm sorry, but you know that. And in some ways, his ideas were ahead of his time. In other ways, or in a lot of other ways, his ideas are more like what we would call Hindu or Buddhism today. And his goal, he would say, would be to get from the physical world, which he would argue is not as real, into some sort of spiritual world. And he, in that theory of forms, he used the cave as an allegory. He said, it's like we're living in a cave and it's dark, but every now and then there's this light that comes in. And so that means there must be some better place. And so all we need to do is really escape the cave and get to some sort of more enlightened place, to which many of you here today may be like, I am living in a cave. Plato gets me. All right, but that's sort of a sad, kind of way to live. But that was Plato's view. Now, this is important. This is very different than what the Bible teaches, right? In the Old Testament, the Jewish people, the Jewish hope was not to die and go somewhere else. You don't find that one time in the Old Testament. In fact, Jesus even taught us to pray this, right? Your kingdom come here, your will be done here on earth as it is in heaven. But over time, Plato's ideas began to actually sink into the church. Like some of the secular, worldview and ideology began to infiltrate the church. In fact, the first heresy that the church ever had to deal with was this thing called Gnosticism. You're going to get a little bit of free seminary today just for coming to the 9:15 service. But Gnosticism, easy for me to say, was the first heresy that they had to stomp out, and in some ways still exists today. In fact, Christianity today called Gnosticism the heresy that wouldn't die. And Gnostics believed that all matter was evil, as in matter was completely incompatible with God. So they believed Jesus didn't have a real body, that Jesus didn't actually rise from the dead, that Jesus was just a spiritual being sent here to give us a message, much like Plato, that what we needed to do was to escape this bad, earth and get to some sort of more enlightened place. In fact, if I could sum up all of what the Gnostics believed in one sentence, it would be earth bad, heaven good. That's what Gnostics believe. Earth bad, heaven good. And while hopefully to you, Gnosticism proved to be a lie, right? We know that God so loved the world, right? That he came to the world. That separation idea still exists, that many people, again, it's the whole point today, many people still think in two categories, that there's like spiritual things and secular things, that there's my spiritual life over here, and then there's the rest of my life. And there's a lot of things that happen when you do that, a lot of, I would say, unintended consequences. But perhaps the most problematic is that we end up compartmentalizing God. And so to demonstrate this today, I brought my Mojo Dojo Casa House with me to church today. And if anybody needs one of these, shoot me a DM. I'll get you a great deal. Game used, one of these doll houses. But imagine this is your heart. Or imagine that your heart, your life is this doll house. For many people, for many religious people, it's like Jesus is in my life. Couldn't find anything to illustrate him. It just felt wrong every time. But imagine Jesus is in my life, but he's like one room of my life. I don't know how I feel about bringing him in the other part of my life. Jesus definitely don't want you involved in the bedroom. We're going to keep you out of that part for sure. And the kitchen, maybe not real. Definitely don't go in that fridge in the garage that only our close friends know about. But we're going to pray to you. We're going to get around the meals. We're going to say, dear God, please use this food to the what? Nourishment of our body, which is hilarious to me when you're at Taco Bell or something. You know what I mean? It's like, God, take this Mexican pizza and this Crunchwrap Supreme and use it to the nourish, and these cinnamon twists that may or may not be styrofoam, and use them to the nourishment of my. So we'll give you that. We're gonna give you that. But I don't know if I really want you in like the living room. Actually, you know what? Small group. Our Tuesday nights from 7:30 to 9, you can come in. But then we also like to watch HBO sometimes. And Jesus, I don't know how you feel about HBO, and I've always sort of wondered. And so maybe you can come here for a little bit, but we'd love for you to just stay in this room right here. In fact, I got to go to work, because I'm like a lawyer, and I'm not saying like one's better than the other, but you're like a carpenter. So maybe actually we need a table. So if you could stay here and you could like work on that, like I don't know if that joke's appropriate. I'm going to go to work and do my work thing, but that doesn't really involve you. I want you to just stay right here, kind of out of my entertainment, out of my personal life, and definitely out of my money and all my, other kind of habits. For many of us, Jesus is like one room in the house. In other words, for many of us, our spiritual life is a house divided. You see it? Now, what's wrong with that? Well, on one hand, keeping the creator of the world in your butler's pantry feels like a bit of a missed opportunity, right? The scriptures talk about how everything was made by God and for God. He's all powerful. He can do anything. Michael Scott said he even has the power to heal leopards. I mean, this guy can do absolutely anything. And so for us to sort of keep him in like one part of our life feels like a tremendous missed opportunity. Jesus, said in Revelation, it'd almost be better if I was like all the way in or all the way out. If you just sort of keep me in one spot, that's a little weird. It's also confusing to our friends outside the faith. I mean, I know a lot of college students, the tension's real, right? But for a lot of college students, it's like on one hand, I want Jesus in my life and I want to honor God, but on the other hand, they told me college is supposed to be the best 4 years of my life, and so I really want to live that up too. I kind of want to have my cake and eat it too. Another word for this would be disintegrated. This is disintegrated. Jesus is in my house, but he's only one room of my house. It's a house divided. And I heard this quote one time, just think about it all the time. Somebody I know told me, they said, a disintegrated life leads to a disintegrated life. Now, that's kind of intense, but I think it's true that a disintegrated life leads to a disintegrated life. The question would be, why? Well, I've thought a lot about this. There's 2 things that haunt me in life, this quote and the Philadelphia Phillies. And the more I've thought about this quote, I think this is true. And the reason it's true is because anytime you have divided loyalties, somebody always loses. Like anytime we're compartmentalizing our life and now our loyalties are divided, somebody always loses. And often that person is you. In fact, I don't know your story or kind of, some of your past, but isn't it true that your greatest regret, like the thing that you regret the most, almost certainly, the things that I regret the most, almost certainly involve some form of compartmentalization, right? I'm gonna keep this from my family. They don't really need to know about that. I'm gonna keep this from the company. It doesn't really involve the company, right? I'm gonna keep God, out of this. This isn't really a spiritual thing. This doesn't really involve God. In fact, you don't have to answer this question out loud. But is there a part of your life that you are tempted to compartmentalize from God? In other words, is there a part of your life that you're tempted to say, honestly, I just don't think that's that spiritual, right? Maybe it's work. Like maybe work's going great and you're like happy to keep God out of it. Maybe work's not going great and you never really even thought that you could involve God in that. Maybe you're behind on rent and you're like, I don't really know what to do, but you never really considered that God might have something to say. Or maybe it's your relationships. Like you would love for Jesus to bring you a date. You just don't want him to chaperone the date, right? It's like he can stay out of that. And all this relationship advice in the Bible, when it's a couple thousand years old, and does that really apply? I don't know, right? You would be inclined to hope that it doesn't, right? Or maybe it's financial. Like we're not really talking about money. This is not a money series at all, but for a lot of us, it's like, this is my money and I earned it. And that doesn't really involve God or church or any of that. Like we all do this. I do this every day in more ways than I wish I did. So there's no judgment here. But what I want to try to convince you of today and in this series ultimately is that a house divided doesn't actually work. Like that maybe that's the biggest problem. That doesn't actually work. In fact, I love what James said about this. James is Jesus' brother. He wrote a whole book of the Bible, which is pretty elite on your LinkedIn. And I love what he said in James chapter 1. And this is great advice for anybody who is struggling today. So if you're here and you are struggling with something at work, or you are struggling relationally, or you are struggling financially, this is what James said in chapter 1. We'll put it on the screens. He said, if you need wisdom, ask our generous God, and he will give it to you. I love that. He will not rebuke you for asking. So God's not going, finally, now you want to know where you've been. Now you want advice. Now you want me in your life. Now you want, wisdom or some help from me. James is going, God's not like that. I've been with Jesus. He's far more gracious than that. He's a generous God. He's not gonna rebuke you for asking. But when you ask him, be sure that your faith, this is interesting, is in God alone. Do not waver, for a person, here's our word, with divided loyalty is as unsettled as a wave of the sea that is blown and tossed by the wind. In fact, such people should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Their loyalty, here it is again, is divided between God and the world, and they are unstable in everything they do. Now, I love this. If you came into church today and your heart was feeling a little unstable, a little unsettled, maybe life felt a little unstable, James may have just diagnosed your problem. It may be that you have somewhere along the way unnecessarily divided the spiritual part of your life from the rest of your life. James is going, the reason that you feel a little unstable is because you're a little internally divided. The reason that life feels a little unsettled right now, that you feel unsettled in your mind or your spirit, right? Just your attitude, is that perhaps your loyalty got a little bit divided. And I think James is right. Because when we take God out of the Monday through Saturday part of our life, we get a couple unintended consequences, namely an absence of purpose and a surplus of fear. This is the nature of any space without God, okay? This is true of secular cities. This is true of my heart on a given week. If I'm kind of keeping God walled off, right? If I'm keeping God walled off, what do I have in my life that week? Well, I have an absence of purpose, and I have way more fear than humans were designed to walk around with. In fact, we'll talk about purpose, especially next week, right? But success and fulfillment are not the same thing. There are people here today who make millions of dollars, but you're bankrupt of purpose, and it drives you crazy, and you gladly would trade some of your income for a little more purpose. Well, James is going, maybe the reason that you have an absence of purpose in your life is because you have walled off God from your job, right? Or maybe this is why you have fear, right? Have you ever feared God getting involved in certain parts of your life? Please, God, don't get involved in this right now. Everything's going really good. Well, that could be a sign that you're a little internally divided, that your heart's divided. Or have you ever feared that God was not going to be involved in your life, or because God was not involved in your life? That could also be a sign that your heart is a little bit divided. So in this series, we want to live a little bit less like a house divided and a little bit more like an open floor plan. Does that make sense? Where God is involved in all these different areas of our life, where whatever conversation we're having in the living room, we know that God is right there in the kitchen. Does that make sense? James would say that's how you can become a little more stable. That's how you can become a little more settled, a little less unsettled, by inviting God. This is crazy. This is a new idea. This is scary to some of us. By actually inviting God into where you live and where you work and where you play. You're like the same person in all those spaces. Another word for this would be integrity. The idea of integration. Integrity comes from that math word integer, which means what? Anybody know? You're like, I was told there would be no quiz. Okay. Integrity comes from the math word integer, which means whole, okay, which means not divided. In fact, this is a big idea for the series. I would argue, based off what James is saying, that spiritual maturity equals spiritual integrity. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. I mean, what is spiritual maturity if not the integration of faith into every part of our life, right? Because what's the opposite? Someone who calls themselves a Christian, but their company values don't actually look like it. Call yourself a Christian, but your relationships don't really look like it. Call yourself a Christian, but your finances, your financial life doesn't actually look like it. That's not spiritual maturity, right? What is spiritual maturity if not the integration of faith? It's us integrating faith into every part of our life. And if that's true, then, in one sense, you could give discipleship a new definition. That perhaps discipleship is just our daily decision to oppose this type of division. It's your choice every day to say, I refuse to believe the lie that my faith cannot come into my classroom, that I can't bring my faith into my classwork, or into that lunch appointment, or into that conversation on the sidelines. I think we make discipleship and spiritual formation way more complicated than it needs to be. What if growing in your faith just looks like opening up more doors of your heart to God, inviting God into more parts of your life? Maybe it's just going into that meeting, or stepping onto that field, or walking into your fraternity house, saying, God, you are welcome here. I want to honor you here. I want to bless you here. I want to be used here for your purpose. Use me here for your purposes. Using your Monday through Friday, this is big, as worship too. Like that was the bomb that Paul dropped in Romans 12. And if you grew up in church, you may know this verse, but this is a crazy idea that Paul introduced in Romans 12. And this is what he says, again, we'll put it on the screen. Paul said, therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is fascinating. He says, this is your true and proper what? Worship. My translation at home says this is your spiritual act of worship. In other words, all the Monday through Friday stuff, all the everyday things, all the mundane sort of things, all my work life stuff, the stuff that nobody cares about, the stuff that your spouse doesn't actually want to hear you talk about, all that stuff is actually the opportunity we have to worship God. Paul's going, this is your true worship. That stuff, that's your spiritual act of worship. And this was again, a brand new category, a total paradigm shift. He's going, look, in light of the fact that Jesus gave his life for you, what if you gave him more than one day a week? What if you gave him more than 10% of your income? What if you opened up your whole life and your whole life was available to God? God, Jesus, you gave your life for me. I'm going to live my life as a worship response to you. Another way to say it would be this is a huge idea. In the Old Testament, all the sacrifices took place at church. In the New Testament, all the sacrifices take place out of church. This is crazy. Back in the Old Testament times, they would literally bring their work to worship, like as like a sacrifice to God, like the first fruits of their work. So like my friend Randy is a mechanic. So Randy would show up to work with or worship with like a muffler. Like he would show up to church with a muffler probably, and they would have been like, another muffler. That's how they talked back then. And another muffler, put it on the muffler pile. But it's like, why, Randy, if you would actually bring some other parts of the thing, we could actually build like a church van and actually be productive here. They would literally bring their work to church as worship. Now here's the thing. We don't bring sacrifices to church anymore. Nobody showed up this morning saying, where do I put the grain, the goats? Again, maybe the South Oconee people do. I don't know. But most of us did not show up today why does he always pick on them? I don't know. With a sacrifice at church, right? Here's why. Because in the New Testament time, we stopped bringing our sacrifices to church and we started taking a new tradition instead. Does anybody know what it's called? It's called communion. And the reason we started taking communion was to remind ourselves that there is therefore now no more sacrifices needed to make us right with God. Does that make sense? And Paul's going, look, in light of the fact that he died for you, you don't need to bring the sacrifices to him anymore. Now you take those sacrifices and you live your life as a worship response. Now it's, an everyday act of worship. It's Monday through Friday. It's Monday through Saturday. Now, Randy doesn't have to bring his muffler to worship. Now, Randy worships by how he runs his business in a godly way. You see it? That's the shift. That's your true and proper worship. That's your spiritual act of worship, not just his, but all of us. Now, your worship, my worship, is how you live, how you work, and how you play in your sorority house, on that date, at the office, in the neighborhood, even the HOA, okay? In your classwork, guys, on the golf course. This is how you love God and how you love your neighbor. James, in that same chapter, James chapter 1, he has this awesome phrase, these two words, true religion. Now true religion is the name of a jeans company. Well, I actually think it's an amazing application of this verse, of this passage. But James is essentially telling them in James 1, true religion is not what you do with your hands on Sundays. True religion is what you do with your hands on Mondays. And in that chapter, he talks about things like taking care of the widows and taking care of the orphans. Paul's going, yeah, I agree, that's your true and proper worship. Now, regardless of what you believe, maybe you're here today and you're not a Christian, and if so, I'm so glad you're here. This is hopefully a good kind of first introduction to Christianity, and certainly Cara's story was, oh my goodness. But regardless of what you believe, would the world not be a better place if Christians lived like that? If every Christian woke up tomorrow and said, you know what, we worshiped Sunday with a great service and that was wonderful, but now I'm gonna go worship with the task that I've been given today. I mean, Jesus had a name for the people who only sacrifice on Sundays, right? Those are the people that he called the hypocrites. So in the third part of the series, the last part of the series, we're gonna talk about what would this look like? What does it look like to integrate your faith and your work? What does it look like for your faith to show up at work? What does it look like for your faith to show up in your classes? Is that appropriate? Are there ways that that is not appropriate? It's going to be fascinating to debate that in a couple weeks. But one thing is not debatable, and it's the kind of big idea we've been talking about the whole morning, that you were never meant to separate the spiritual part of your life into just sort of one day of the week. You were never meant to separate that from the rest of your life. And I would say this, you were never just meant to endure the work week. That's why I'm so excited about next week. You were never meant to just endure the Monday through Friday and everybody's working for the weekend just so I can live it up on Saturday and come back Sunday, get recharged and sort of run it back. Like, I believe that you have purpose, a calling on your life, that you were made on purpose with a purpose. Paul would say in Ephesians 2, good works prepared in advance for you to do. So I'm going to do my best next week to help you find your calling, to kind of put some spark back and some purpose into the work part of your life. But today, before we get there, today, as we kind of begin to land the plane, I want to give you just a memory verse. One verse that I think would be cool if our whole church memorized this verse today. And I'll show it to you in a second, but it's from Psalm 86. And there's really one guy, maybe more than anybody other than Jesus, obviously, in the scriptures, who I think really embodied this kind of living my whole life open to God, trying to be the same person in all the spaces, and that was King David. If you've been here the last few weeks, you know that we've been in a series. We just wrapped up a series called Honest to God. David was always doing his best to just bring God into these different spaces of his life, tell him how he really felt about it, asking God's help to come in. David wanted to have that sort of integrity of living my whole life before God. And there's this one prayer, Psalm 86, 11 words. I mean, you can memorize 11 words that David prayed in Psalm 86 that I think is just a great starting place for this series. It's a verse that I've been memorizing the last few weeks, and I want to invite you into as well. And this is what it says. This is what David prayed, Psalm 86. Give me an undivided heart that I may fear your name. I love that. That's the verse. That's all it is, 11 words. Give me an undivided heart that I may fear your name. Can we say that all together? Give me an undivided heart that I may fear your name. I love that he says, give me. It's like David knew that this does not come natural. It's like David knew that maybe he can't produce that on his own. It's like David knows the thing that you and I know, which is that the natural thing for us to do is to live walled off. It's the natural thing for us to do is to say, God, I don't know if I want you in these parts of my life. I don't know if I trust you in these parts of my life. Nobody ever taught me what it looks like to invite you. Nobody ever said I could. Some people told me I couldn't. So God, this is not natural. You're going to have to give me an undivided heart. And then I especially love the next part, which you just read. That says, so that I may fear your name. That sounds scary, but David's going, no, that's the thing I want. That's the outcome I want. And we talked earlier, but a divided heart, a compartmentalized heart, fears all kinds of things. I'm scared that God's not going to come through. I'm scared that God's going to, I'm scared of this. I'm scared of that. I'm scared they're going to find out. Right? I'm scared of how this is going to affect me. I'm scared of what the cost is. And David's going, no, I want to fear I want to get back to that place where you are the main thing I fear. And I'll tell you, I am only beginning to figure out what this verse means and beginning to live this out at 37 years old. But for me, the best thing about pursuing an undivided heart, about asking God for an undivided heart, trying to have an undivided heart, is that you get to wake up every day only really worried about one thing. And that's pleasing God. And so this is what I want to invite you into this week, pursuing an undivided heart, right? What if, again, crazy idea, instead of having a spiritual life, in the rest of your life, you just had one life and one God who is over all of it. This week, I want you to think about what it would look like for you to pursue, to ask God for an undivided heart. We already talked about, what are some of the things that you might be tempted to compartmentalize from God. But I want to give you 3 questions that I would love for you to talk about in your small groups. These would be great small group questions. And if you're not in a small group, maybe you could just get some friends together and y'all could form a little 3-week small group between here and Thanksgiving. Or how about this? Or you could do this in the office. You could get some friends together and say, hey, would you want to watch this thing or listen to this thing? And he talks fast. I don't recommend 1.25 speed, but y'all watch this, and then we're going to get together over lunch and talk about it. It's a series about integrating faith and work and what it would look like. Or maybe you run the company, you're the boss. You don't have to make people do it, but if you're the team leader or you're the leader of the company, you could invite people into this. You can invite them to even share their perspective about what it's like to integrate faith or their faith into work. And again, how does that make you feel? And you might be surprised at the outcome. So regardless of whether this is an office group or a friend group or a small group, 3 questions and then we're done. Number 1, is there anything trying to divide your heart from God? Love that. Is there anything trying to divide your heart from God right now? Trying to take the place of God in your life? This is a great time to evaluate that. Maybe it's thinking about my college students, maybe it's a guy or a girl that's trying, they're not bad, but like maybe this relationship's not actually helping you stay focused on God. I'm not saying that's a red flag, maybe a beige flag. I don't know all the terms officially, but it might be something worth evaluating. Maybe it's a job opportunity. It's like, this looks like a great job opportunity, but I got this thing in my spirit that's going, I don't know if that's actually gonna help me live the life I wanna live as well. Maybe it's something else that you use to kind of help you de-stress, no judgment, but good time to evaluate that. Is there anything trying to divide your heart from God? We already read it earlier, but when our loyalty is divided between God and the world, then we're unstable in everything we do. We're as unsettled as a wave of the sea. And so I want to help you kind of get past that. Number 2, do you believe that God cares about the mundane parts of your life? Why or why not? You know this, but almost all of your life is mundane. That's what we're talking about. We're only here for an hour, and then the rest of our life, we're kind of back to the grind, right? We're talking about all the everyday parts of your life, all the boring stuff, all the paper, all this stuff. Do you believe that God cares about that or not? It'd be fascinating to talk about that with your group, why you believe that or why you struggle to believe that, right? I wonder what would happen this week if you practiced believing that. If for 1 week you practice believing that nothing is random, that nothing is trivial, that nothing is unimportant, or how about this, that nothing is unseen. You want to figure out how to have an undivided heart and invite God into your Monday through Saturday life. You walk around practicing, believing that nothing you do is unseen before God. He sees everything you do. And then last one, number 3, what would it look like for you? And again, this is really just if you're a Christian. What would it look like for you to worship God with your life Monday through Saturday? Wherever you're going tomorrow, whoever you're going to see, whatever you're in charge of, whatever you've been stewarded, what would it look like for you to worship God with that? Like tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., you get out of your car and you're walking into the office or you're going to, open the shop. 7:30 a.m. tomorrow when you're at the bus stop waiting to get to your 8 a.m. We're praying for you, right? 1 p.m. tomorrow, and your son or your daughter finally goes down for a nap. What does it look like to worship God in that moment? I wonder if it just looks like taking that still, quiet moment, maybe one of the only quiet moments you get in a given week, and praying that same prayer that David did. God, give me an undivided heart so that I may fear, so that all the other things that I'm concerned about become way less significant. And I'm only worried really about pleasing you and focused on pleasing you. So I want to invite you to talk that out and try that. But I'll tell you, we're going to close with a song, and I love this song, brand new song. And maybe this is the kind of song that we just, you might want to just sit and listen to today. It's a new song. I'll give you permission to do that. But the song is called Monday Morning Faith. And so much of what the song says is exactly what we've been talking about for the last 30 minutes. Monday Morning Faith. But what I love, especially, is the line at the end of the song is powerful. Towards the end, this awesome line. It says, hell's not scared of a Sunday faith. But it goes on to say, but you know what really makes darkness run is when we begin to worship God with our lives on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday and Saturday. So Heavenly Father, I pray, would you show us what that looks like? It's amazing to think about how you have spread all of us out as a church all throughout this city to go and be the hands and feet of Jesus, to represent you on the job site and in our neighborhoods and in our apartment complexes and in our dorms. And I pray you would help us not take that opportunity lightly. I pray that you would use this series and to inspire us to live on mission for you. I pray specifically that prayer that David prayed. Would you give us an undivided heart, that we wouldn't be scared to bring you into the spaces we go tomorrow, that actually bringing you into those places, having the courage to bring you up in conversations, to do a good deed on your behalf, might, not just be the thing that somebody else needs to spark their faith, but might actually be the thing that we need to spark our faith as well. And I pray all this in Jesus' name.